I guess we'll move on to the Best Paper Award for CC Grid 2021. So I was not told which of the authors is presenting. So
it's Hariharan. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay. So
Yeah.
this is, let me get myself organized here. Hariharan Devarajan, apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, will be presenting the paper DLIO, a data-centric benchmark for scientific deep learning applications. So I will let you take it from here.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy. So greetings, everyone. I'm a PhD candidate at Illinois Institute of Technology, Chicago. Today, I'll be talking about my work called DLIO, a data-centric benchmark for scientific deep learning applications. This work was done in collaboration with Illinois Tech and Argonne National Lab. So scientists utilize deep learning methods to reduce computational complexity for their applications. It is used in a variety of domains, such as material science, biology, physics, and many more as shown on the right. Efficient ingestion and processing of data is crucial for efficient deep learning methods as seen often in cloud environments. However, the data characteristics of deep learning methods in scientific domains are not very well understood. Generally, in scientific deep learning methods, applications utilize deep learning frameworks such as TensorFlow, PyTorch, and Caffe to provide infrastructure to optimize data management that are required by these deep learning applications. In general, data management in any deep learning technique can have these three phases. One is the data ingestion, that is how data is read from several sources into memory for input processing. Data pre-processing, that is what data operators are applied in memory before feeding it to the training. And finally, data communication of how data exchange occurs between various workers of deep learning training and framework. These phases have their own software and hardware optimization supported by these deep learning frameworks. In this work, we observed that there is a lack of understanding of I/O behavior within scientific deep learning applications running at extreme scales. Therefore, we aim to systematically characterize various scientific deep learning applications and build a representative benchmark to enable I/O research in terms of improving efficiency of deep learning applications in HPC environments. To this end, we present the DLIO benchmark, which is a data-centric benchmark for scientific deep learning applications. The source code of this benchmark is publicly available at my GitHub repo. To achieve this representative benchmark, first we need to understand the I/O behaviors of scientific deep learning applications. For this, we use the applications present at Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. For this study, we use a production supercomputer at ALCF data, and all the applications that we ran were part of ongoing projects such as Argonne Data Science Program, Aurora Early Access Science Program, and others. We run these applications with 128 Knights Landing node over Lustre file system, which has a peak bandwidth of 240 gigabytes per second. All these applications that we tested utilize TensorFlow framework, and therefore we use its internal profiler along with Darshan, which is a low-level I/O profiler. We also built a bunch of analysis tools for combining the high-level details from TensorFlow profiler with the low-level I/O profiling from Darshan to get a better holistic view of the application. So in this work, we look at 8 applications from the various projects I talked about before. Let us look into each of these applications on their high-level goals and their data set. First, we have the neutrino and cosmic tagging with UNIT, also known as Cosmic Tagger. This application uses deep learning to separate cosmic pixels with background pixels and neutrino pixels within the images. The application has a 33 gigabyte data set containing 43,000 samples stored in one large HDF5 file, with each sample having an average size of 40 kilobytes. The deep learning model itself runs over 150 steps with a batch size of 32 images. The next application is the distributed version of the flood filling networks implemented in TensorFlow. In this application, the deep learning model segments brain tissue image into complex and large shapes of neurons. The application has a 2.3 gigabyte data set with about 19,000 samples, each of size 32 kilobytes. The deep learning model trains over the data set over 150 steps with a batch size of 32 samples. Next, we have the Cosmoflow benchmark, which is used for studying the features and distribution of deep dark matter in the universe. This application is again written in TensorFlow with a 2 terabyte data set in TF record format. The dataset consists of 256K samples spread across 1024 TF record files. The training runs over 256,000 steps with 1 image per training step. Next, we have the Cancer Distributed Learning Environment project, also known as CANDLE. This application classifies RNA sequence gene to detect normal or tumor tissue within the image. It has a 700 megabyte dataset with about 1,000 records, with each record having a record of size 256 kilobyte. The dataset is stored and read by the application in CSV format, and the deep learning model itself consumes the entire dataset and runs through 60 epochs with a batch size of 20 records per training step. The next application is the Fusion Recurrent Neural Net FRNN that predicts disruption in fusion plasma. The application consists of a 6 gigabyte dataset of NumPy array files distributed across 2 megabyte files, each containing 1024 samples. The training model uses 100 estimates with a batch size of 512 samples per training step. Next, we talk about the ImageNet benchmark at ALCF. It's an image classification application which utilizes popular convolution modules such as ResNet and AlexNet. The benchmark consists of 2 terabyte TF record files with 1024 files, each containing 4,000 samples each of size 256 kilobyte sample size. The training of the deep learning model runs over 1,000 steps with a batch size of 32 kilobytes. The last two applications are deep learning climate segmentation benchmark and the Hamilton Monte Carlo simulation, both using deep learning methods. These applications generate data in memory and does not perform any IO as a part of these applications. So now I'll be going into the IO behavior on each of these applications. In case of Cosmic Tiger, we observed that 22% of the overall time was spent in performing IO. The dataset was mostly read sequentially with a low aggregate bandwidth of 11 megabytes per second. The low bandwidth was due to the small transfer size of each request. Upon investigation, we found that the HDF5 file was chunked with chunked IO of 4 kilobytes, resulting in the small data access and lower bandwidths. As shown on the portion of the timeline on the top, only around 10% of the overall IO was overlapped behind computations. The distributed flood filling network, or DFFN, we see that it's also an HDF5 application, which spent about 18% of its overall time in performing IO. The dataset was consumed by multiple parallel processes and achieved an overall bandwidth of 11 gigabytes per second. The distribution of transfer size, the right bottom figure, centers around 64 kilobytes and 100 bytes. The 64 kilobytes is for the data file, which is due to the chunking, and the 100 bytes is for the metadata file on which it reads before it goes to the data file. There is no overlap between computation and IO in this application because both the HDF5 and deep learning run on different runtimes. Next, we have the Cosmoflow benchmark, which utilizes TensorFlow's data pipeline within the application. We see that it only spends 12% of the overall time in IO. The application runs over 4 epochs with an aggregate bandwidth of 36 gigabytes per second. We see that the dataset is evenly distributed among all the processes for training. It uses a transfer size of default 256 kilobyte, which is the default within TensorFlow for this input pipeline. The application, we see that the IO is completely overlapped with the compute. That's because of the input pipeline from TensorFlow. And out of this 12%, 23% of the time is spent on pre-processing. ImageNet benchmark is similar to Cosmoflow, as in it uses the TensorFlow data pipeline to perform IO. It spends about 15% of the overall time in performing IO with an aggregate bandwidth of 32 gigabytes per second. It reads the data set on demand based on the number of steps it was run with, and hence we see a non-uniform distribution of samples read across the files, the bottom right figure again. The request size here was the default 256 kilobyte from the TensorFlow framework. And finally, we see that the IO was again completely overlapped like the previous application. The Candle application reads the dataset from the CSV file and then spends 36% of its time performing IO. In this case, each process reads the whole dataset row by row with an aggregate bandwidth of 8 gigabytes per second. Currently, the size of datasets is only 700 megabytes, and hence it can fit in memory of each process. We see that each row is 256 kilobyte, hence we see a transfer size of 256 kilobyte across all processes. Finally, we see that in the timeline that there is only one single thread which is used to perform IO, and there is no overlap between the IO and compute for the CSV dataset again. The FRNN application, which uses NumPy datasets, spends around 23% of the overall time in IO. It reads its dataset, which is a 6 gigabyte dataset using NumPy APIs with an aggregate bandwidth of 28 gigabytes per second. There are two types of requests here, one on the metadata and one on the data. However, the frequency of metadata calls dominate within this application. That's why we see on the top bottom, we see a lot of frequencies for the small accesses. Also, we notice that there is no overlap between the application and the within the application for the IO and the compute. The last two applications, as I said, are the climate segmentation benchmark and Hamilton multicolor simulation. These two algorithms do not perform any discrete operations. However, these applications perform periodic checkpoints of the model using STT-IO interface provided by TensorFlow, which is in tens of megabytes in size. Hence, we see the total write time in this case was less than 1% of the overall time. A general classifications between these 8 applications could be made based on data formats they use. We see for Cosmic Tagger and distributed flood filling networks, it uses HDF5. For CosmoFlow and ImageNet benchmark, it uses TF-Record. And for Candle and FRNN, they use their own custom data types such as CSV and NumPy array respectively. For the HDF5 workload, we observe that they generally use a single large file with POSIX VFD in HDF5 files. There is no framework integration within TensorFlow and other DL frameworks for these data format. This forces the application developers to generally perform shuffling and input pipeline designs themselves within the application. This is leading to the serialization we see between IO and compute, where there is very minimal overlap between those two. For TensorFlow's TF-Record data format used by CosmoFlow and ImageNet benchmark, the data set is generally represented into multiple files, and they are chosen at random by the framework to reduce bias. They utilize independent IO with proto-buffer deserializations to read the samples out of these files. The framework inherently supports IO and pre-processing optimizations such as parallelism, data compression, data prefetching within the data pipeline, which can be easily utilized by the application developers. And finally, we see that all files are read completely sequentially on demand by the TensorFlow framework, and the shuffling is all generally done in memory. For the other types of data format, we observe there is less support for optimization within TensorFlow or any other framework. The IO pattern is completely based on what kinds of APIs we use to read these data sets and what was the input pipeline designed by the developers. Using these classification, we built a benchmark suite which can accurately represent these 8 applications and others which have similar features. The design of the benchmark is on the right. The benchmark can be configured using arguments which configure the internal parameters of the benchmark. During the execution, we have a modular format handler to extend support to different formats as required. Additionally, we support fine-grained profiling within the benchmark for better understanding the overlap, the specific IO behavior of different phases or pre-processing behavior of different functions. Finally, we also support for data generation so that we could scale the data for our scaling test of our applications. In the current state of the DLIO benchmark, it supports the following configuration. It uses TF records for TF records, HDF5 format, CSV, and NumPy arrays. It uses a file access pattern of shared or multiple files with the support of independent or collective IO based on support from the interfaces themselves. We can emulate different dataset reading patterns such as sequential or random as supported again by the interfaces. Also, we have two types of IOs. The first is the dataset reading, and second is the model checkpointing over n steps of computation. Finally, we can tune the request size distribution within our benchmark for different interfaces, depending upon how they support them. To evaluate our benchmark, we use a similar setup from the Theta supercomputer. In the next coming workloads, I use the DLIO benchmark for regression test, and then I apply the scene optimizations back to the scientific applications to measure the impact of our optimizations. Before we go to the optimization, the first set of tests we did was to check the similarity between our benchmark and the deep learning applications. In general, based on the metrics we used, we see that the applications are very close to the DLIO benchmark. We see for certain applications there is a variance of about 6%. That's because the actual applications have a very complex distribution of request sizes, whereas for simplicity, we use median of request sizes within the benchmark. We see in most cases that can cover the behavior. Then we use our microkernel of the CosmoFlow application and Cosmic Tiger application within the DLIO benchmark and try different optimizations available. The purpose of these tests was to quickly prototype and see what different IO optimizations are available and how they impact the performance of the application overall. In this example of CosmoFlow, we changed things like what are the different transfer sizes, what are the read parallelism options, what are the pre-processing parallelism options. Additionally, we then run all these cases on Theta supercomputer. We get the optimal values, which are presented on the right on the figure, and then apply them directly to the real application. What we observe is that the optimizations that we saw in our benchmark could be almost closely and accurately transferred back to the real applications. More details on how we did these evaluations are there on the paper. Finally, as most applications today use smaller data sets, we generated large data sets with the same pattern as seen by these applications using the DLIO benchmark, and then tried to perform strong scaling tests on these applications. The complete set of results are there in the paper, but I would like to highlight two of them here. The application on the left is the ImageNet benchmark, which uses multiple files within the app. In this, we see the TensorFlow framework along with the multiple files provides almost nice performance for IO scalability as we increase the scale. On the right, we have the distributed flood filling network kernel from the DLIO, where HDF5 is not per se integrated within the TensorFlow framework. And as we increase the scale, the IO performance because of serialization and lack of overlap between compute and IO starts dominating, and we see suboptimal IO performance as the scale increases. To summarize, in this work, we looked at the behavior of modern deep learning applications present at ALCF. We developed a benchmark that can accurately represent these applications and can be utilized for IO optimizations. Finally, through our benchmark scaling test, we observed that we need a better support for scientific data formats within deep learning frameworks to provide better data exchange between scientific simulations and AI frameworks. Thank you for attending this talk. I'll be glad to take any questions.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
All right, I will relay a question now from Laurent, which is, how can you be sure that the applications, the selected applications, cover and represent the diversity of applications that we can find? And do you plan to increase the considered applications if needed?
Yeah, so that's for sure a consideration. We knew that it's a representative from one lab. And so one of the main things we want to look at now is collaborate with other labs, other domain scientists to see what are the other applications. The idea here is to build a methodology through which people can even profile their applications for IO, because essentially when we were trying to look at this, like you have so many profilers at different stages, how can you look at like high level profiling versus low level? What should you use on a supercomputer? And so to me, this work provides a methodology and which can be applied. And the idea of the benchmark, that's why I said that the main thing I built there was the modular format handler, because you could use different kinds of formats, different kinds of patterns. And the idea of that benchmark is to be as extensible and simple as possible so that you can start covering different kinds of use cases you start seeing. But this was kind of our first effort to kind of understand at one lab, what are the different kinds of applications we have and how do they work in terms of IO behavior.
Great. And I guess I'll just finish with one question from myself. So I was wondering, I was really interested when you talked about the optimizations that you could you could learn from this. And do you see any way that that process could be automated in the future?
That's a good question. That's a follow-up work I'm working on right now. So the main idea here is the fact that you could do optimizations is a big win in itself, because mostly people who are writing TensorFlow applications probably don't know how HDFI works, right? Because they are not IO experts. So it's very important, and I agree with you that even though these optimizations are there, most people don't know how to use it. And so it is really important in a way to provide some form of guidelines through this work. Like, for instance, we showed that people were using chunk sizes without seeing the impact on IO. And so this work in a way could provide those guidelines. But yes, you're right. Like for some of these could be automated. For instance, how much parallelism of IO we should use so that we are not incurring too much of interference on the parallel system. Should we use more coordinated IO? And so on and so forth. So yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity in a way to build middleware libraries which can abstract this.
Great. Well, yeah, I think that would be very useful, definitely. So, so sorry, we're running a little long, so I guess I'll close the questions here. And we just wanted to officially share your Best Paper Awards. This is first prize, and you'll be getting a plaque as well. So congratulations to you. And I believe $500, is that correct? So yeah, so
yeah, that's it. Yep.
Right. All right. So congratulations, and thank you for a great talk. And I guess we'll hand it over to Raj to
Congratulations.
closing remarks.
Yeah.